Welcome to the Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Hosted by John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hi, this is Dave.
And this is John.
And welcome to episode 14 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today we'll be interviewing Holly Black. She's the author of the best-selling children's book series The Spiderwick Chronicles, which were adapted into a major motion picture. Recently she's been working on a graphic novel series called Good Neighbors, and her new novel White Cat is set in a contemporary world in which magic has been outlawed, so only outlaws have magic. So we'll be talking to her about all that, and also... Uh-oh, John.
What?
My precognitive abilities are starting to kick in, and I'm getting this weird premonition like I'm going to mysteriously disappear about 10 minutes into this interview.
Well, I hope that doesn't happen, but, you've never been wrong before.
No,
well, if that happens, I'll just be prepared and I'll take over.
All right. It's No, I hate to shatter the seamless illusion that we work so hard to create here at Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And this is actually a little bit embarrassing to admit, but we don't actually do this show in one take. So actually what we do is record the interviews first and then record everything else later. So we actually recorded this interview a week or two ago on a day when the internet basically was a series of tubes. Or at least that's what you'd think from how slow it was. So I don't know what the problem was. It's never happened before. It's all very mysterious. And all we can really say for certain is that it was not in any way our fault at all.
So don't blame us.
We did everything just like we always do. Usually it works. So I think really the only rational explanation is probably evil internet fairies. I think that they heard us talking about them and they couldn't curse our cows not to produce milk since, we don't have any cows. So they cursed our internet connections instead.
The milk I had in the refrigerator did go bad though. So.
Yeah, that's another thing. We'll have to get those. We'll get you fairies. But yeah, so anyway, so the internet was terrible and I got kicked off completely. So I'm going to disappear about 10 minutes into this interview. And so John had to soldier on without me. He was heroic and managed to go on.
I managed to even control my weeping, that Dave was gone.
But even after I was gone, Holly's audio was sort of fading out in places. So I think more than one person must have been having internet issues. But fortunately, we still got plenty of great material to use. And this interview has been edited a lot to make it flow as smoothly as possible. But there are definitely still a couple places where it's a little choppy. So that's why. And so we hope you enjoy the interview. And then stick around after the interview where John and I will be talking about action figures and evil fairies and stuff like that.
All right, let's get our pre-recorded interview with Holly Black on the phone.
Hello.
Hi, it's Dave and John from Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
It's Holly on the other end.
Thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so first of all, what books did you read when you were younger that made you want to be a writer yourself, and what sort of early writing did you do before breaking into print?
My favorite book when I was a kid was I think his name was Paul Gallico, Thomasina, and I love that book. That was my favorite book. I remember reading a lot of Lloyd Alexander, Madeline L'Engle, Tolkien, Michael Moorcock, Kenneth Lee. I think that those were probably really big influences. I always knew that I would be writing fantasy. It never occurred to me that I would be writing anything else because that's what I read from the time I was a kid. I did this Juvenilia panel recently in New York with Scott Westerfeld, Cassandra Clare, Elia Dawn Johnson, Justine Larbalestier, and David Levithan, and we all read from stuff we had written in high school. And it was truly the greatest panel I have ever done. The audience was crying with laughter. My favorite one was Scott's, which was a demon who solved crimes in space. It was fantastic. And I really wish that we did more of that because I think it's probably helpful to people to see how truly bad we were. But I wrote a novel when I was in 8th grade. It was called Knights of the Silversun. It was terrible, and it was about a dragon, I think. And there were a bunch of adventures. It was like a mashup of every book that I liked at the time. So it was like a bunch of really angsty people who had weird names like Death going to, I believe, fight dragons and liberate vampires.
Okay, so apparently your mom raised you to believe that supernatural creatures like fairies were real. So what was that like growing up?
I was afraid all the time. My favorite story is that she once told me not to astral project, because if you astral project, you're leaving your body empty and something else can get into it. Mm-hmm. Something I had never really considered before. And so I became terrified that I would astral project by accident. I was pretty direct example of the kinds of things that I was really concerned about. I was worried trees would grab me. We had really big, creepy trees in this old house that we lived in. They would sort of scratch at the windows at night. I was scared of everything, and I think it is one of the reasons why I read so much folklore, because I thought I need to learn how to protect myself.
Do you remember if you had a moment of epiphany where you're like, wait a minute, trees aren't going to grab me?
I have never had that moment of epiphany. I mean, I feel like one of the things that you have as an adult is you have sort of how you were raised, and this core set of no matter what you want to believe intellectually, you will always, in the back of your mind, have this set of beliefs of how the world works that you were raised on. And so it is very, very easy for me to default to that.
When you were talking about astral projection, I was kind of thinking of like, you know, when people get older, they like worry about like, oh, I hope I don't throw my back out. And it's like, oh God, I hope I don't actually astral project. Like leave my body empty. You know, that would be awkward.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you went through like an adolescent rebellion stage where you're like, I'm going to astrally project and you can't stop me.
No.
So apparently you were a big Dungeons and Dragons player.
I think Dungeons and Dragons is great because, and especially was great for me because I love telling stories, and there's this period when it's no longer cool to play with dolls.
Wait, what?
It's no longer right, exactly. But and I was devastated at the idea that I no longer got to get together with my friends and play dolls, which did not make me look like it didn't make me look good. And Dungeons and Dragons really fulfilled that desire for group storytelling in a way that was, at least at the time, considered cool enough to get by. So, I think it was, for me, the thing that let me kind of go on and keep telling stories. And also, it's how I met my husband. It's how I met Tony DiDelizzi, who I would wind up collaborating on Spiderwick with. And it's how I met my critique partner, Steve Berman. So I have a lot to thank D&D for.
All right, so you mentioned that you met, your collaborator, the artist Tony DiDelizzi, playing D&D. But so once you guys got together working on, Spiderwick Chronicles, like what was the collaborative process like?
Well, we didn't actually meet in a campaign. I met because he was illustrating Dungeons and Dragons, and I was working for a tiny, tiny magazine about gaming, and I came up to interview him. And we wound up just talking about all kinds of stuff. Both of us were raised on a lot of the same art. Both of our moms were painters and crafters, and so we had a ton of stuff in common, and then we all started hanging out. But the collaborative process with Tony it was great. It was really the first time I have ever done anything like that. It really came out of our friendship and the fact that we love to talk about stories. And he had this field guide to fairies that he really wanted to do, and I really wanted him to do. I thought it was fantastic. It was beautiful. And I said, well, I could write. I've been doing all this research for my first book, Tithe, and I've been doing all this fairy research. I have all this stuff. It's just a couple paragraphs. Let me do it for you. And from there, it wound up becoming, the 5 books of the Spiderwick Chronicles plus that field guide. But it all started with the field guide, and it all started because, I so wanted him to do this project.
Okay, so your series of children's books, the Spiderwick Chronicles, were adapted into a major motion picture. How did that come about, and what sort of role did you play in that production? Well,
the Spiderwick Chronicles were optioned really early on, around the same time that they were acquired by Simon & Schuster. They were optioned by Paramount, and everyone told us, don't get excited. It's just an option. Never get excited. Don't get excited until it's greenlit. And Mark Waters, the director, signed on way back then, and we had met with him, and he was great. And we sat down and talked about stuff he was really interested in about the books, and they weren't finished at that point. We were up to, I think, 2 or 3 of 5. So a bunch of different scripts were written by different writers, and we got to see them. Everyone was very generous about keeping us involved, and we got to give our thoughts, whether or not they liked them, or whether or not I mean, when you have your work option, you really are putting it in the hands of other people, and they have to take ownership of it. Once it finally did get greenlit, It was so hard to believe that it was actually happening, because over the years, at every single step of the way, at each script, everyone had told us, don't get excited. It doesn't mean anything. And so when it finally was greenlit, I really don't think that I actually thought that the movie was going to happen until I was walking around on the set. And I thought, this is all very expensive. I assume they will have to actually put out the movie now. But it was great. I mean, it really was. I think because everyone involved was so good about keeping us involved, and also just were great people who really wanted to make a great movie. I was really, really happy. I think the film was great. I think they really captured the spirit of the kids, and the fairy folklore, I think, felt organic and of the earth and strange and out of the corner of your eye. And those were the things I cared about most. That, and the fact that if I was a kid, or the young me would have really enjoyed it. I would have been a little scared, but I would have really enjoyed it.
So is there going to be anything else further in the Spiderwick Chronicles?
We just finished the last of the Beyond the Spiderwick Chronicles. It came out in September. It was The Worm King, and that's the last Spiderwick book, which is really strange for me, because I've been working on them pretty much, the entire time that I have been publishing. I have been working on Spiderwick. When Tithe came out, which was my first book in 2003, I was already writing the Spiderwick Chronicles. So this is the first time, literally, that I'm not writing a Spiderwick book in all the time I've been publishing.
Right. So recently you've been writing some graphic novels. Why don't you tell us a little bit about those projects you've been working on?
I've been writing the Gnaber series, which is illustrated by Ted Nafee, who I was a fan of, and I'm very lucky agreed to come on and do this with me. And they're older books. They're for teenagers, and the inspiration for them is there was a murder about 100 years ago. This man by the name of Michael Cleary killed his wife, Bridget Cleary, because he thought she was a fairy changeling. And it's this really, really weird story, because 100 years ago isn't that long. My great-grandmother, who, I knew when I was a kid, would have been alive then. It shocked the nation, because they just couldn't believe this in modern times, such a thing could occur. And it's an interesting story both ways. And I think that this is the thing that I always love about fairy folklore. It's interesting if she was a changeling, and it's interesting if she wasn't, which sadly she clearly wasn't. But her family, some members of her family were there. Her father was there, and he believed that the next day his daughter Bridget would come riding back on a white horse. And when she didn't, that's when the whole plot began to unravel, and people started decompensating and making it obvious that they had a hand in her disappearance. So I thought, okay, I will take the parts of this that I'm really interested in. I will put it in contemporary times. I will change the story so that I can be, have my cake and eat it too, and tell the story of a girl named Rue whose mom goes missing, and people start thinking maybe her dad, a professor named Thaddeus, had something to do with it.
Did you have any trouble adapting to that graphic novel format?
Well, it's a challenge. I mean, it's one of the things that was fun about it was the challenge, but it was also a challenge. I had to be really, really aware of whether or not I was on the left or the right hand page, so I could think about, what's the last panel you see before you turn the page? How much action is there? How much, are they just standing around talking? Is there a way where I can break that up? I like writing short, so that aspect. When going into it, I thought, well, this will be great, but there's ways you can write too short, when you're writing a graphic novel, there are things that you really need to include. One of the things that I learned was that really leaving the clues in the visuals annoys people. I learned to think more about the pages as spreads and think about what's happening in the last panel so that you'll turn the page, keeping that tension high, making sure people are moving and the scenes are changing. One of the things that I was really excited about, though, that you can do in a graphic novel is you can do flashbacks, where really in books you shouldn't do too many flashbacks. But, in a graphic novel, you get to do tons. So I was really excited about that.
Most of your published work concerns fairies. Do you think you might publish something in a totally different vein someday, like maybe, say, a story about space marines or something?
In my one of the things that I loved about doing short fiction is getting to play with stuff that that's different than I normally do. And I've done stories about a competitive eating contest with the devil. I've done stories about I recently did a story about vampires. I've done a bunch of things in that form, and that's been great. But then my new series actually has nothing to do with fairies. It's been interesting to start a totally different world. I'm working on a series of books. The series is being called The Curse Workers, and the first book is White Cat, and it's actually based on I was thinking about magic and the way that we organize magic in books. Often we have schools of magic like Harry Potter and many, many other things. We have lone wizards like Gandalf. We have a sort of medieval master and apprentice system by which one teacher teaches a small number of people magic. And I thought, well, what are other organizational systems? And I thought, organized crime. So this is a world sort of coming out of that idea where there's always been magic. There's 7 types of curse magic. And in 1929 in the United States, it was made illegal in what they call the ban. And just like Prohibition led to the rise of various crime families, and them becoming more powerful, the ban led to the rise of curse magic crime families. And so the book is set in contemporary times. We must assume not only that there is no curse magic, but there is no RICO Act. So the mobsters sort of continued unto the present day. There's a kid. He comes from a family of con men and curse workers, although he is not himself a curse worker. His family's sort of loosely affiliated with crime families. They've mostly been just grifting. His mom is in prison for working somebody. She's an emotion worker. She tried to get some guy to give her all his money. And Castle's in private school, kind of trying for the mostly straight and narrow when he wakes up on the roof of his dorm, and he doesn't know how he got there, and he has to investigate his past to figure out exactly what's happening to him and whether or not it has to do with a girl he killed 3 years ago, who was his best friend, who he loved, and who, perhaps not coincidentally, was the daughter of a crime boss. Sorry, Castle. So that's what I've been working on. Very different for me. I wanted to break a lot of my habits. I wrote it in first person, which is the first time I've ever done a novel in first person. I wrote it in present tense because there was a lot of looking back, and I didn't want to write a ton of past perfect. So it's coming out soon. I'm excited but nervous. It's difficult to do. It's nervous making to do something different.
So why is it called White Cat?
One of the things that he does remember is that he was having a dream of a white cat. And a white cat figures prominently throughout the book. It is extremely loosely based off the fairy tale of the White Cat.
And so, in addition to the White Cat, you also have a recent book out called The Poison Agers, which is a collection of your short fiction.
It was published by Kelly and Gavin at Big Mouth House, which is part of Small Beer Press. And it's a really fun project. It's the kind of project that I always thought about doing, where you are essentially working on the book almost entirely with people that you know. So, with Kelly and Gavin publishing it, my husband did the illustrations. I've been writing short stories for about 10 years. The short story form for me was really, really fun because I got to do things that I don't normally do, and it was really, really hard for me I wrote my first novel before I ever finished a decent short story. I did a modern fairy tale story called The Land of Heart's Desire, which sort of tells a little bit about what's happened after the end of the modern fairy tale series. The title story, Poison Agers, was a book it was a short story I did for the Restless Dead Anthology, and it's about 3 girls who are undead, who have been eating some kind of poisonous matter that this gentleman who is pretending to be their father keeps feeding them, and he has some kind of complicated plan which they are trying to unravel. The Night Market was a story I wrote set in the Philippines. My mother-in-law is Filipino. My husband's half Filipino, and it was really funny to get to I've been over with them, but it was great to get her to tell me all kinds of really great specifics, but stuff that she couldn't understand why I wanted to know. Like, well, what are the weeds called? Why would you ever need to know? Like, even knowing I was writing a short story, she was like, why do you need to know this stuff? And I got to use some of the stories that she had told me, like how when she was a kid, there was this woman who came to their village, and she was possessed, and she bit a coconut in half.
Yeah, actually, speaking of the Philippines, one of our listeners, Charles Tan, he lives in the Philippines, and he wanted us to ask you, do you have any other plans to write other stories set in the Philippines?
I would love to, but I am so, like, it's something where I really want to make sure I get it right. Mm-hmm. It's just really, I think whenever you're writing outside of your own direct experience, it's really, really important to get it right.
Okay, so now you recently edited 2 anthologies, Geektastic and Zombies vs. Unicorns. Right. So what made you decide to get into editing anthologies?
Well, Cecil Castellucci, who I co-edited Geektastic with, and I were at Comic-Con, and we were standing on a very long, like an endless burrito line, and we were talking about the things we had seen, and somehow we got to the idea of what would happen if Jedi and Klingon woke up after a night of heavy drinking, and they woke up together, and they were horrified. They had betrayed their people by being together, like a modern-day Romeo and Juliet. And immediately after sort of generating this, we both wanted to write this story. And so we decided, well, we can write it together. And then we realized that there was nowhere in the world we could publish this story. It's about science fiction and fantasy, but it's not of it. And it is perhaps too much of it for any mainstream place we could think of. And so we were like, all right. And we sort of tabled it. Called her about maybe a couple weeks later, and I said, I know what we can do with that. We can edit an entire anthology.
Okay, and so you want to talk a little bit about Zombies versus Unicorns, how that came about?
Zombies versus Unicorns is an anthology that I am currently editing with Justine Larbalestier, and it is it is very fun. It started when Justine was talking crap about unicorns, as she's to do, and saying just how great zombies are. She hates unicorns. Who hates unicorns?
Evil people.
Evil people, exactly. And I admit, I do not like this. I don't like zombies. Who likes zombies?
Well, I like zombies, but it's okay.
Smell.
That's true.
They decompose. They shamble. What's to like?
I don't know. I kind of like all that stuff.
You like all of that? Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually feel that I'm the unicorn side editor, as you can probably tell. I feel like my side may well be the mocked side, the side that maybe not everyone is behind. But I have been encouraged by polling people in small numbers. There's definitely some unicorn support out there, more than you think. Although, in my experience, all Spiderwick kids vote for zombies.
So are there any actual stories where zombies do fight unicorns?
There is a story with both a zombie and a unicorn. It is Garth Nix's story. But they do not fight.
Ah. Well, now, if a zombie and a unicorn did fight, who would win? I mean, I would think a unicorn would win because, like, zombies aren't very hard to kill. And the unicorn have that big giant horn that they can use to, like, just gore the zombie. So
I would also think that.
Yeah.
And not only that, but unicorns purify disease. So I feel like they are a healing entity. Even pieces of unicorns were used folklorically to cure various different ailments. So I think that the zombie has no chance.
Yeah, maybe they could actually cure the zombieism, and that would be even better than fighting. That would be like unicorns are just so magical they don't even need to fight.
Yeah, they can cure. If you have warts or anything, they can cure you from across the room. Unicorns are awesome.
Okay, and you're also working on the new Borderlands Anthology, right, with Terry Windling?
Yeah, with Ellen Kushner.
Ellen Kushner, right?
Doing it, and Terry is consulting and hand holding, and telling us the answers to all the questions that we are baffled by.
So you want to talk a little bit about the history of that series for people who don't know?
Yeah, Bordertown it's a series of urban fantasy short stories that were edited by Terry Windling about this town that sat between the mortal world and the realm, which was Elfland. And in it, you had this juxtaposition of the very urban with fantasy, and specifically elven fantasy. And the city itself is a very strange place. Magic doesn't always work there. Technology doesn't always work there. It's unclear exactly how you find it, and it's unclear exactly where it is. It's all cities and no cities. And it is one of the fundamental pieces of literature that created urban fantasy as we know it today. It was very inspiring to me. It was inspiring to an entire generation of people who've gone on to write about fairies and about urban fantasy generally. So Ellen and I really wanted to put this book together so that people who, writers who have loved that series will have a chance to play in it now. And people who didn't know about it will have a chance to experience it. All the people who are writing for it are people who loved the original series. Kat Valente, Cory Doctorow. We have, Will Shetterly's writing a story. Nell Hopkinson's writing a story. And we have a ton of stuff still coming in. And it's just so great to get to see that place again and also see different voices in it.
Okay, so as sort of an old school, urban fantasy reader, what do you think of the sort of contemporary urban fantasy scene, which doesn't really bear much resemblance to where urban fantasy came from, where it's mostly like killing vampires and shagging werewolves and whatnot?
Well, it's pretty weird because urban fantasy really seems to have two distinct meanings depending on who is saying it. And I think that urban fantasy sort of grew up in the romance community in a different way. And so I think people coming out of romance think of urban fantasy as being about vampires largely, but also, vampires and werewolves primarily. And I think people who came out of science fiction and fantasy think of it as being about fairies primarily and about this idea of numinous magic. So I think it's really weird because these two definitions seem to exist side by side, confusing everyone. And I think that paranormal seems to be the get around word. If you say paranormal, I think people think, okay, it's probably going to be more romantic. And then you have this sort of, I think, kind of coming up the middle of them, you have this very noir inspired stuff, like the Dresden Files, and and also part of the paranormal series. You have the Anita Blake books, which have a detective aspect to them. You have a bunch of these books having that as part of their structure.
And so I understand you're going to be teaching at the Alpha workshop this summer?
Yeah.
And so what made you decide to do that? And have you done much teaching before?
I've done a bunch of teaching before, both for teenagers, and then I have taught at Clarion twice. So I've wanted to teach at Alpha actually for a long time. I asked them before, but they didn't take me. They didn't have room for me that year. So I'm really glad that they're letting me come now. I love talking about writing, and teaching writing gives me a chance to do that. It's something I think about a lot, and so it's a place where everybody else is also thinking about it, and it's really I get very nervous actually speaking in public, but for whatever reason I don't mind at all teaching.
Yeah, so I mean, how much would you have loved that at when you were a teenager to have a workshop like Alpha available to you?
I would have really I mean, I went to a program at Rutgers that was a Summer Arts Institute, and it wasn't specifically for fantasy writing. It was just general writing, and they had an art department and a theater department, and they did a bunch of stuff. And I think it really had a significant impact on my life to realize that there were other people like me out there. You know, I grew up hanging out with a lot of hoodlums, and going away for a summer and going away for any stretch of time like that, I think you get to see yourself the way people who haven't known you your whole life see you. I think sometimes you can get stuck being seen a certain way, and you can get stuck thinking of yourself a certain way. And sometimes if you're a writer, that way can be, weird or you don't get to show this side of you. And I think actually being in that kind of environment changes your whole sense of who you can be and what you can do. It definitely did for me. I think it kept me probably from getting in a lot of trouble.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Holly Black for joining us on the show and for being such a good sport about all our technical issues. So, when Holly was talking about how as a kid she read all these books about fairy tales and folklore and stuff because she felt like she had to learn information that would protect her from the real fairies that she was sure were a threat to her. I was thinking about that, and it's kind of funny because I used to read a lot of fairy tale and folklore and mythology and stuff for a kind of similar reason. But, I used to play all these adventure games, and particularly in the King's Quest series, there were all these, you would meet all these characters from fairy tales and folklore and mythology. And so a lot of the puzzles, you wouldn't know how to solve them unless you knew the story. Like if there's a little gnome and he asks you to guess his name, it helps a lot to know the story of Rumpelstiltskin. And so I would read just book after book after book of fairy tales. And I always thought, when I was a kid that like the King's Quest series would go on for generation after generation, and my kids would be playing, King's Quest 30 and stuff. And so that I would, be able to use this great store of knowledge to just go adventuring, to just play these adventure games all throughout my life. It was kind of disappointing that, that they don't make them anymore, and I just know all these fairy tales. And fortunately, I write fantasy, so I get to use a lot of the stuff. Did you ever do anything similar for a game or anything like that?
The closest thing I can think of is when I played Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego. I sat there with a atlas or a almanac because there was always all these clues about like what flag was waving, so you would have to know what the flags were in order to find out what country that Carmen was going to and all that. I was thinking though, actually, given how much we've talked about King's Quest on this show, we could have like a subtitle like King's Quest Love Fest.
Yeah, I also have something I wanted to mention about Robert Asprin's Myth series. That's
that's the other most commonly referred to item on the show.
That's for later though, but yeah, I do wonder. I hope there's somebody out there who's a fan of those things. And
yeah, almost everybody listening to it is like, what the hell are they talking about? King's Quest? What is that? Actually, some of the younger generation anyway is familiar with it. Like I'm pretty sure Matt London was telling us that he had been like replaying some one of the iterations of King's Quest fairly recently.
Okay, good. Yeah, if anyone's listening to this and has any idea what we're talking about, post a comment and let us know.
Yeah, King's Quest fans represent. Come on, like.
But I do think it's really great if you have games that kind of inspire an interest in going and reading classic literature and learning about the world and stuff like that. I wish there were more of those things. I wish they would bring back King's Quest, frankly, and they could have all sorts of other things. I was thinking it would be cool. I mean, I don't know if anyone would play this but me, but if they had like Shakespeare Quest and the whole world was just all characters from Shakespeare plays, and in order to solve the puzzles, in order to know what you were doing and stuff, you would have to be familiar with the play. So you would go and read, you would meet characters, and you're like, oh, this character is from this play, and you would go and read it and stuff like that. I think that would be really cool. So if there are any game designers out there who want to lose a lot of money, there's an idea for you.
Well, if you do it right, you could probably actually make money on it just by, marketing it to schools and stuff. That would make that a learning tool rather than just a game.
But so like when Holly was talking about, she was talking about how you get to a point where it's not cool to play with dolls anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that was making me think about how, like when I was a kid, my mom would always be like, go clean up your dolls.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be like, what dolls? I don't know. I don't have any dolls. And she's like, all those Star Wars dolls. And I'm like, those are not dolls. Those are action figures.
Exactly.
Girls play with dolls.
Right.
Those have nothing to do with dolls whatsoever. And I was thinking that, actually, when I think back on that now, that it seems like that kind of just sort of petulant, like intellectual dishonesty is exactly the same kind of thing you see from authors like Margaret Atwood when they're saying that they don't write science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, I don't write science fiction. I write speculative fiction. It's completely different.
Yeah, that's true. That actually is.
I don't play with dolls. They're action figures. But I was going to say that when I used to play with the action figures, that it was really fun, and I would just invent these great adventures, and like it was really a great preparation for being a writer. I've heard actually a lot of authors kind of make like Holly did make that analogy between playing with toys and writing stories, and it is kind of disappointing as you get older how. Because, you probably will find this hard to believe, but I was actually kind of popular, when I was a kid in daycare, because I was really good at making up games and making up stories and stuff. And actually, I used to make my own action figures out of just paper and Scotch tape and stuff. And then, I was kind of like George Lucas almost. We were talking about like George Lucas and his like empire, kind of multimedia empire. And that was kind of what I was like in daycare, because I had, my like comic books and the action figures, that were connected to the comic books, and then like the sort of make-believe games we would all play that were connected to and it was all interconnected. And so I would actually like sell kids action figures that I made. And actually, I got shut down because it turned out the kids were skipping lunch, and then they were using their lunch money to buy my action figures. And so when that came out, they banned me from from selling any more stuff in daycare.
Wow. Your career crushed at an early age.
Yeah.
You're right, though. I do find it hard to believe that you were popular.
But yeah, but when you're a kid, you can achieve a substantial measure of popularity by having a great imagination. And then, once you get to be a teenager,
it becomes a liability for jocks to beat you up.
Yeah. And what makes you popular as a teenager is just, how much, what portion of the day you spend intoxicated, and with whom. And then when you get to be an adult, what gives you social status is how much money you have,
Although I think, to a large extent, that same sort of coolness based on being really imaginative and creative, that's sort of like a new way to be popular these days too, just because sort of geek culture has sort of taken over the world to some degree, it's like still there's a lot of people who still view the idea of being a geek in a negative light, but the richest people in the world today are probably almost all geeks, right? And the fact is, as a geek, you can have just like legions and legions of fans that will make you way more popular than most people who are not geeks. So
yeah, so I definitely do think it is that the internet has made it so much better to be a sort of creative kind of person and to connect with other people like that. But I do kind of miss playing with my action figures. And like when you're a kid, it was just like I remember I was really into Transformers. And there were
that is so surprising.
And they're all the Constructicons, and so they're each a toy piece of construction equipment, let's say like a cement mixer or something, and they turn into a robot. But then if you get 5 of them together, you can combine them into a gigantic robot.
Right.
And
I remember those.
and I only got 2 ever of the 5, and they were only like the right arm and the left leg or something, so I couldn't even connect those 2 together in any way.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, oh man, if I could have just gotten that giant, I think it was called Destructor robot, I would have been so happy. And like really nothing that could happen to me now would be as exciting as if I had been able to get Destructor, when I was 5 years old.
Yeah, I hear you.
But like I heard Neil Gaiman say that he sort of always resolved to spoil his children because he can remember being a kid and what it was like to get a toy or something and just how incredibly happy it made you.
Yeah.
And he's like, wow, if I can just create that much human happiness in the world for $10 or whatever, it's a small price to pay.
Right. Yeah, I remember vividly this one time, like, I was a big He-Man fan when I was a kid, and I remember, like, I was just always so excited when I got a new He-Man action figure, and there was this one time I was at, like, Kmart with my mom, and I always wanted to get, like, these certain different characters from He-Man, and they just never had them, It's like they always had the same ones over and over, the ones that I already had, And then so one of them that I never had was Triclops. So one time when I was at the store, we walked up to the section where they had the toys, and this mother and a kid in the store, like they just took the last Triclops, and I was like, oh, so close, But then it goes on. So they start walking away with it, but then the kid's like being a brat or something. So the mother like sort of takes it out of the cart and is like almost putting it back, and I got so excited. It's like, oh, keep being bad, you little jerk. I can get that Triclops, But then like he begged his mother enough and that he would be good, and so she took it, and so I was that close to getting the Triclops finally, and but it wasn't to be. I don't remember if I ever actually did get it. I seem to recall that I did, but
it wasn't that Triclops.
No, it wasn't.
That was the one you wanted.
Yeah. I kind of wonder, like, what the heck happened to, like, all of our toys? I don't know, maybe you still have them in a chest somewhere at your house, but, I mean, like, I don't have any of my toys, when I was a kid. Like, no G.I. Joes, no He-Man, no Transformers, and I had all that stuff. Do you remember Mask?
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah. I had a bunch of those, too, and, I watched the cartoon and all that, but, I mean, I don't know what happened to any of that stuff. It's kind of sad.
I'm guessing your mom threw it out?
Maybe. I mean, it's possible I threw it out when I got, to be a teenager or something. I was like, oh, this stuff is junk now or whatever. But
oh, no, I would never do that. It was definitely my mom. I mean, because this seems to happen generation after generation where, moms just throw out, they're like, oh, no one's going to want these stupid baseball cards anymore.
Oh, yeah.
And, you're like, Mom, I could have retired on those baseball cards.
Yeah. Well, good thing Mark Hamill's mom didn't throw out all his comics, right? I mean, it's like he became... He like sort of started the whole comic book collecting thing by selling off his comic book collection.
I did not know that.
Oh, you didn't? Oh,
no.
Yeah. I mean, that's why basically I think Mark Hamill never really had to work much after Star Wars, besides the fact that he's getting money off all Star Wars residuals. But I mean, it's like he like made a ton of money off selling comic books.
Did he get residuals off of that? I thought like...
Oh, I don't know. Maybe he didn't.
Because I thought like Alec Guinness negotiated for a percentage, and the rest of the actors were just like, no one's going to want to watch this movie, and just accepted like a flat fee, and so Alec Guinness was just like set for life,
Oh, yeah, no, I don't know, that could be true, but I mean, regardless of what they made off Star Wars, I know Mark Hamill, made a ton off selling comic books.
But no, I really wish I still had my Star Wars action figures. I mean, because I could play with them, but also I have this really, I really wanted to. I have an idea to make a stop action movie using them that I think would just be absolutely hilarious. But it would be so much funnier if I had those old, sort of beat up ones, with the little lightsaber you can push out of the guy's arms.
Yeah,
it would really be so much funnier if I could get those. And so I've thought about buying new ones, so I can make my stop action movie. And when you're a kid, like you think like $100 is a huge amount of money. You're like,
right,
Mom, how much is a car? And she's like, it costs a lot. You're like, more than $100? She's like, yeah, a lot more. But so recently I'm thinking about making this movie, and I'm like, well, come on, I have, $100 isn't that big a deal to me anymore. Maybe I could just go and buy a collection of action figures I could use. Mm-hmm. And those things are freaking expensive. Oh man, I'm like, wow, even as an adult, I can't afford to buy these things. Now I'm kind of, I can understand why my parents didn't want to blow their money on this stuff. But
well, you know what? I think probably the guys who make Robot Chicken, they probably have all of our action figures now.
Yeah,
because they have to destroy so many of them when they're doing their show. They probably they've bought every single old action figure from the 80s.
That's what I was actually wondering. Like when they do Robot Chicken, because I was thinking of kind of doing something similar.
Right.
Do they have to get rights to those characters or anything, or can you just use old action figures?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, well, no, because it's parody, so it's probably all fair game.
But even to use, I mean, like the story obviously would be protected, but to actually use somebody else's, prop basically in your movie.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah, if anybody listening to this knows the answer to that, I'm kind of curious about that.
Or if anybody from Robot Chicken wants to come on the show and talk to us about it, that would be awesome.
But one of my favorite writers is George R. R. Martin, and he has, I don't know if you've ever been to his website, but he collects like toy knights and miniatures and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've ever looked at that, and he has like huge castle like dioramas in his house and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then he writes these fantastic books about knights and castles and stuff. And so I wonder how much does the collecting those toys and painting them and thinking about them and having them around you, how much does that help you when it comes to write about those kinds of subjects?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I actually have I don't know if I would say a collection, but I certainly have a bunch of old D&D miniatures, because I played D&D, when I was a teenager and stuff, and we had all the sort of lead miniatures that you would paint yourself, and I painted a bunch of them, and so I still have them, and I just have them sort of lining up at my bookshelf. Maybe I'll take some pictures of them and post them on the show notes, but I don't know if it's the miniatures, but D&D certainly was a huge factor in getting me to where I am. Just to even consider creating anything like a piece of fiction or anything. I don't know that I would have gotten to that point without D&D. That's where I took my first steps creatively, was trying to run a D&D campaign. Just writing my own adventure and from scratch, not running a module that you bought in the store. And so that was the first thing I did, and eventually I gave that up because I was like, I didn't like all that whole interactive part where the stupid players would ruin all my elaborate plans, and that's when I sort of took off and tried to write something instead, and then which eventually led me to editing. But I mean, D&D just like I think it's just games like that are so great for like inspiring creativity in people, because I mean it kind of forces you to become creative, especially the Dungeon Master. I mean, like you have to be really creative to do that.
And George R. R. Martin, I guess he's into role playing games too, and he, I guess for years, I guess he says he was just like addicted to this superhero role playing game, and he's like my friends and loved ones and stuff, they were ready to stage an intervention for me because I was just like obsessed with rolling up characters, and stuff. It was it was really detracting from my writing, and so he's like, well, come on, I'm spending so much time in this role playing game, there must be some way I can make some money out of this. And so that's where the idea for Wild Cards, the Wild Cards Shared World Anthology series came from.
Right.
And
that's
cool. So like all the people in the gaming group were the, sort of the initial seed group of people who wrote stories, all based on their characters for that series.
I guess that would be the third subtitle of the show, would be Ode to Wild Cards. We've talked about that a lot too.
Because I've been thinking about this because, I don't know, maybe whenever Stephen King's On Writing book came out, it was, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, I think, but when I read that, he basically says, if you want to be a writer, you have to read 4 hours a day and write 4 hours a day and make time to do that no matter what, if it means, like reading books in restaurants while you're waiting for your food, that's what you got to do. And you have to cut out everything that doesn't directly contribute to reading or writing. You have to cut out TV. It's just all stupid anyway, and video games and, all that stuff. And so that really actually made a big impression on me. So after I read that, I mean, that sounded, because basically what he says is, TV shows and movies and things, they may have good stories and they may teach you a little bit about putting together a plot and stuff, but they won't give you the same sort of familiarity with words and ability with words that reading fiction will. And I thought, yeah, that sounds sensible to me. So I did really make an effort to focus on reading prose as much as I could and cut out the video games and TV and stuff to the extent that I could. But then I think about like George R. R. Martin, he's got his like role-playing games and collecting miniatures and stuff that all seem to be contributing to his writing. And I wonder, like, should I be having more geeky side hobbies? I mean, would that actually, in the long run, benefit my creativity?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's probably different for every person. I mean, for Stephen King, he probably felt like he had to go that route. And I mean, I think a large part of that is probably, making sure that these other geeky pursuits don't actually take over your life and don't, make you stop writing or whatever completely. Because it's certainly easy to get totally lost in, like, say, a TV show, especially now that they have them on DVD, where like you can sort of, sit and go through a whole television show within the span of a couple days. And so, think about like how much time you would waste doing that, or you get a video game, and one game, you can spend 80 hours or more of playing time, actually playing through the game.
Or if it's World of Warcraft,
yeah,
it can just be your whole life.
Right. That's a game that apparently is so addictive. I'm afraid to even try playing it. Oh, although I actually have tried playing like the sort of MMO games online before, and I don't know, they don't appeal to me as much as like sort of as just self-contained game that where you're like playing through a one specific narrative.
Yeah, I never really got into the MMOs either. I mean, partially because I was saying I sort of started really focusing on fiction around the time that they started becoming really popular.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's also like, but the selling points are kind of like, well, you can interact with people, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And I do like being the hero, of the story, and you start playing the game, and 20 hours later, or whatever, you've saved the world, and like, oh, that was cool, I saved the world. Whereas like I feel like if I logged into a MMO, I would kind of be this level 1 character, and there would just be these like super powered characters all around that I could never possibly hope to compete with unless I wanted to completely devote my life to this game, and I don't.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But like sort of I was saying, I used to sell all my action figures. I guess that's another thing that George R. R. Martin talks about now, is that he has all these kind of spin-off products from Song of Ice and Fire, where there are miniatures and board games and collectible card games and a role-playing game and stuff like that. And I've heard him say, it's kind of funny, he says, I think sometimes, because he's like, because I consider myself a serious novelist, and I wonder, would F. Scott Fitzgerald have a Great Gatsby collectible card game,
Right.
And then he's like, and then I think about it, I'm like, well, probably he would have anything that would support his boozing, Yeah.
Speaking of George R. R. Martin spin-offs, my sister was just up visiting, and we went to Medieval Times, which is this sort of it's like a place where you go to eat dinner, and they serve you in a sort of medieval style, like they sort of give you chicken and soup and all this stuff that would have been available in medieval times, and then like you sit there and you watch a show where it's sort of like wrestling, where it's like, except that they're all dressed in armor and they're fighting with swords and stuff, but it's all like sort of scripted and fake, but it's just like an entertaining show, right? And so there's like a storyline to it though. Like there's a king and there's this prince who went off to make peace with this one evil kingdom, and and he's missing, and they're doing this tournament, and the storyline plays out over the course of the tournament. And I couldn't help but think that this would be so much better if it was like infused with George R. R. Martin-ness. Instead of having the kingdoms that they have there in medieval times, it would be like House Stark and House Lannister and all that stuff, and you had some actual good George Martin plot lines going in there, where like characters that you might have been cheering for would actually die and stuff, and it would be so cool. Like I'd totally go to Song of Ice and Fire times.
Yeah, well, maybe once if the HBO series becomes really popular, maybe they can arrange like a Song of Ice and Fire day at Medieval Times or something.
Yeah, that would be totally awesome.
But just with like writers having hobbies like collecting miniatures and stuff like that, I have heard that, I forget who told me this, but they were saying that most writers, sooner or later, they have to do something tangible, like with their hands, that's not just writing, because writing is so about ideas and so intangible, and that if you're just all in your head, just imagining things all the time, it gets to be overwhelming. And so most writers, they eventually have to start gardening or sculpting, or just doing something where they're actually touching something physically real. I don't know. Have you ever heard anything like that?
No, I haven't. It kind of does make sense to me, though. I think at least part of that is that when you're doing stuff like that, it sort of makes you turn your brain off, for a little while, and you're just sort of devoted to the task at hand, and that can sort of free up your mind to sort of in the background think about your writing stuff, and just can sort of free you up a little bit, because you're not actively thinking about it. It's like you're just thinking, like say you're painting one of these miniatures or something. It's like that's all you're thinking about right at this moment. But I wish there was more tasks like that I found interesting, that I could actually sit and do, because when I was listening to a lot of audiobooks, I don't have as much time to listen to them anymore, but one of the things that I always like to find is tasks like that I could do that didn't require enough mental energy to to perform that I could actually, follow an audiobook. So just sort of repetitive tasks that, well, I guess, like I said, they don't require much mental energy. But like something like driving, for instance, you can drive and listen at the same time. But then there's if you sort of put your mind to it, you can find other things to do. Like even just cooking. If you know how to make what you're making and you've done it before, it's like it doesn't require a lot of thought to actually put it together. So you can do stuff like that, or if you're like cleaning up the house or something like that. But I wish there was more sort of enjoyable tasks like that I could think of to do.
Well, like when you go to conventions, a lot of times you'll see people in the audience knitting, like sitting there and knitting. That's usually that's that kind of thing.
Right.
But like when you mentioned,
I said fun though. No offense to knitters out there.
But like when you mentioned driving, I do kind of wish, like when I moved out to LA, I drove across the country, and so you're just driving 12 hours a day, and I would listen to a complete audiobook from beginning to end, every day, and it was really fun. But, if I was just around the house, I couldn't sit there and listen to I couldn't just like sit on the couch for 12 hours and listen to an audiobook. I would have to, after like 30 minutes, I'm like, oh, I wonder if anyone's emailed me,
Yeah. No, I mean, that's always been the problem for me with audiobooks, is that you can't just sit and listen to it.
But I wish there was some way I could drive, just spend all day driving that didn't, I didn't have to pay for all that gas and all that stuff,
Right.
Well, I did promise some Robert Asprin related material. So when Holly was talking about her new series, which the White Cat, which sounds really, really cool, but when she was talking about this sort of intersection of magic and mobsters, obviously I couldn't help but think about Robert Asprin's Myth series, where he has the mob comes in about halfway through and is sort of a major major element in that story. And when I first read those books, I was young enough. And so like in Cinderella, how there's the fairy godmother. So in the myth books, there's the fairy godfather. And so he's like a fairy, but he's he's like Marlon Brando, the Godfather, kind of.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so when I was reading those books, I was young enough that not only did I not know what the Godfather was, but I didn't even know what the mob was. Mm-hmm. So like my introduction to the concept of organized crime was those books. And so I've reread those books many, many times. And so it's funny because I can still remember what I thought about them at age 6 and at age 8 and at age 12, and how each time I would reread them after I would pick up more stuff. I'm like, oh, now I get it. Now I get that that's a pun. Oh, that's horrible. But I really like that because actually those like Sierra Adventure games like King's Quest, they had the same thing where you're just completely surrounded by characters that are all sort of references to other stories, and a lot of times you don't know what those other stories are until you go and seek them out. Mm-hmm. And so I've always kind of liked that feeling of, I know that this is a reference to something, but I don't know what it is. And it's funny because you can kind of get that sense from things. Even I don't know, I can't put my finger on what gives something that feel. So
like for instance, like when you're talking to somebody, you can tell if they quoted something.
Mm-hmm. But like in Mything Persons, they go to this, I mentioned it before, they go to this werewolf vampire world, and they meet these werewolves called the Wolf Riders, who are sort of, it's a husband and wife team of werewolf riders, and they're kind of activists. And even as a kid, I read this and I'm like, I know that this is a reference to something, but I don't know what it is. Mm-hmm. And I just was reading Wikipedia recently, and it said that these characters are based on a husband and wife team who was the creator of the ElfQuest role-playing game. And that the characters' names in the book are actually anagrams of the the first names of this husband and wife. And like there was in one of the books, there's a character named the Butterfly, and it's just such an odd name that you're like, I know this must be some sort of in-joke or something, but I have no. And for years, I could not figure out what it was supposed to be. And there's also a character in that same book called Edvic. And recently this guy named Ed Vick, who's a writer who I'd actually heard of, he posted on my blog, because I'd written something about that, and he said, oh, actually, this character is named after me. It's authors sometimes will have these charity auction things where they'll to raise money for charity, people will pay to have themselves inserted into the book as a named character. And so this guy Ed Vick, he said that he had won. It had come down to him and this other guy in this charity auction. And in the end, Asprin said, oh, I'll just put both of you guys in. And the other guy, and he says to the other guy, what's your name? And the guy's just like, call me the Butterfly. And just like walked out of the room. And that's all, so that's where that name came from. I know, speaking of other fairy stuff, well, there's this great Gary Larson Far Side cartoon. It's called, the caption is Car Key Gnomes. and there's this guy asleep in bed, and these gnomes are sneaking around, and they're pulling his keys out of his pants pocket and sticking them under the couch, Mm-hmm. And I'm like, that actually does make a lot of sense. I can definitely see that happening.
Right. I've never been big on the car key fairy though. Like, I don't know. I always know where my keys are. I've never been one to like lose my keys and never know where they are. Wow. Although I know a lot of people have that issue though.
Yeah.
See, I just have a box. I have a box where I put my wallet and my keys, and that's where they go. When I unload my pockets, that's where the stuff goes. That's all you need to do. You don't need to worry about fairies. Well, of course, the box is iron, and fairies don't like iron.
Yeah. But probably the best fairy story that I can think of is the Stephen King story that I actually listened to the audiobook years and years ago. But it's called The Ballad of the Flexible Bullet.
Oh yeah, that's a great story.
I haven't read it in years and years and years, but the premise, as I remember, is that there's an editor, and he gets a letter from a writer, and the writer has written this little at the bottom of his letter. He's written this little slogan or something. It says something like "in fornit fornum" or something like that, and the editor doesn't know what this means, and he just when he sends the writer back a letter, he puts the same thing at the bottom, just kind of as randomly, and then the writer writes him back, and he's like, "Oh my God, you know about the fornits too?" And so it turns out that this writer believes that there are these elves, these sort of fairies that help writers write their books. And if you put peanut butter on your typewriter and then go to bed, the fairies come out at night and type on your manuscript. And the story, it's so like I listened to the audiobook as I was driving actually, and and so the editor slowly becomes convinced that the fornits are real and kind of starts going. And you don't know whether he's going crazy or whether it's really happening, but you feel like he's going crazy, and you feel like you're going crazy. I mean. The story is just really good at just really messing with your perception of reality.
Yeah, well, no, those things are real, though, so.
Shh. Don't tell them that.
It doesn't work so great in a MacBook, though, because there's really nowhere for the peanut butter to go. It's kind of messy.
But so, Holly's writing these graphic novels now. And actually, in our last episode, we didn't have time to talk about this, but you were asking John Langan about, are there academic programs where graphic novels are making inroads, and that actually reminded me. There's this podcast I listen to sometimes called Comic Geek Speak. I don't listen to every episode because it would be impossible to listen to every episode because they release like 8 hours a week of material. But I've listened to a lot of them, and there's this one guy named Adam Murdo who's one of the hosts, and I really like his comments. He's just really thoughtful and interesting, and so it turns out that he actually went to I guess he did this program at Bowling Green where they have a master's in popular culture. And so he actually wrote his master's thesis on Crisis on Infinite Earths. Actually, on this Comic Geek Speak, if you go and check out episode 527, Adam Murdo sort of interviews one of his old professors from Bowling Green about their program. So if you're curious about that sort of thing, you should go listen to that episode and find out more.
So what are you qualified to teach if you have a master's in like pop culture? I mean, that kind of seems like a cool master's to pursue.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I assume you're qualified to teach
pop culture.
Pop culture. I mean, I don't know. To teach, English, or I don't know. But I mean, not, maybe people want to get degrees not just so that they can teach, but so that they can, start podcasts and.
Right. Yeah. Well, because you totally need a master's degree to do that.
Yeah. We don't let anyone on this show unless they have a PhD in geekology.
Yeah.
Anyone host this show. John and I are both. I mean, we don't like to brag, but we're both Dr. Kirtley and Dr. Adams.
Yeah. I mean, it's too pretentious to ask people to refer to you that way, so I never do. Of course, I sign my name that way, but that's something else entirely.
And that was our show. Thanks everyone for joining us. If you'd like to share your thoughts about any of the topics we discussed today, we'd love to hear from you. Just go to Tor.com and click on podcasts, and then Geek's Guide to the Galaxy episode 14 and post a comment there. And be sure to join us next week when we'll talk to Dan Carlin, science fiction fan and host of the popular Hardcore History podcast. See you then.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Tor.com. For this episode's show notes or to subscribe to this podcast, visit Tor.com and click on Podcasts. For more information about your hosts, visit JohnJosephAdams.com or DavidBarKirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Deadsville 9 Entertainment. If you've enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.